30 years old and still without a husband. Cressida's laughter cut through the afternoon air like broken glass while gentlemen in tall riding boots gathered along the white fence surrounding the exhibition paddock. Dust swirled beneath a pale autumn sky as another young nobleman stumbled backward from the enormous black stallion rearing violently at the center of the ring. The crowd gasped while the horse kicked furiously, sending the wooden mounting block tumbling across the dirt. "That is the 9th man today." Lord Harland Ashgrove shook his head slowly beside his wife while adjusting his leather gloves. "Nobody can manage that beast." Venetia leaned closer toward Cressida with amusement spreading across her painted lips. "Perhaps they should send Leora into the ring. She has nothing left to lose." Cressida nearly choked on her champagne. Perdita covered her mouth, pretending to cough while laughter shook her shoulders. Several guests nearby turned their heads politely, though smiles tugged at their expressions. Leora stood several paces behind her family, gripping a folded shawl between her fingers while heat spread painfully across her neck. She had learned years ago to keep her face perfectly still during these moments. Reaction only invited worse. Then Lord Harland turned his head slightly, just enough for his voice to reach her without facing her directly. "Every daughter in this family has brought something valuable to our name." His pause carried weight heavier than silence. "Every daughter except one." The crowd's attention returned to the paddock as another rider attempted to approach the stallion from the left side, speaking gently with outstretched hands. The black horse stamped the earth twice before lunging forward with such fury that the man threw himself over the fence to avoid being trampled. Nervous laughter rippled through the spectators. Nobody noticed Leora stepping slowly away from the crowd. Nobody noticed her moving quietly toward the side gate of the paddock while her sisters continued mocking her from behind decorated fans. Nobody noticed anything at all until the stallion stopped. The enormous animal, trembling with rage only seconds earlier, turned its massive head toward the far edge of the ring. Its ears shifted forward, its breathing changed. Then, without any command or gesture, the black stallion walked, slowly, directly, straight toward the woman everyone had already forgotten was standing there. The entire exhibition fell silent. But before we continue, if you enjoy powerful emotional stories filled with heartbreak, jealousy, betrayal, and breathtaking vindication, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us continue. Leora Ashgrove had not always been invisible. There had been a time when her laughter carried through the morning rooms of Ashgrove Manor as naturally as sunlight falling through the tall eastern windows. There had been a time when her name appeared at the top of every invitation list across the county, when young gentlemen adjusted their cravats nervously before approaching her father for introductions, and when Lady Margot herself personally selected fabrics for her eldest daughter's gowns each season. That time felt like another lifetime now. Ashgrove Manor stood among the finest estates in the western counties. Its pale stone walls climbed 3 stories above manicured gardens that stretched toward ancient oak woodlands bordering the river. Inside, polished mahogany staircases curved beneath ceilings painted with pastoral scenes of shepherdesses and golden harvests. Crystal chandeliers hung in every formal room. Portraits of 5 generations of Ashgrove ancestors lined the grand corridor, their stern faces watching silently over a family obsessed with legacy. Lord Harland Ashgrove governed the household with the precision of a military commander inspecting his regiment. Every dinner seating arrangement required his approval. Every guest received careful evaluation based on title, fortune, and political usefulness before receiving an invitation. Marriage was not a matter of affection inside Ashgrove Manor. Marriage was strategy. Marriage was reputation. Marriage was the only currency daughters were expected to produce, and Leora had failed to produce it. At 30 years old, unmarried, she occupied a strange position within the household. She was not a servant, yet she performed more domestic labor than most of the paid staff. She was not a guest, yet she hovered at the edges of gatherings like someone unsure whether they had been invited. She was not disowned, yet her father had stopped introducing her to visitors nearly 2 years ago. Each morning began the same way. Leora rose before dawn to inspect the kitchens where cook needed assistance planning meals for whichever guests Lord Harland had invited that week. She arranged flowers throughout the main rooms. Because Lady Margot insisted, fresh arrangements appeared daily, but never remembered to instruct the servants herself. She reviewed household accounts that her mother found tedious and her sisters considered beneath them entirely. By the time breakfast arrived, Leora had already worked for 3 hours. Her sisters descended the staircase at 9:30. dressed in embroidered morning gowns, expecting tea poured at the perfect temperature and bread still warm from the oven. None of them ever wondered who had made those small comforts possible. During afternoon gatherings, Leora occupied whatever chair sat farthest from the conversation. She wore the same rotation of modest dresses, all dark blues and grays, while her sisters sparkled in silks and imported lace. When guests addressed her, they often mistook her for a companion or a governess visiting from another household. The first few times it happened, the mistake had stung badly. Now she simply corrected them quietly and continued pouring tea. Society's whispers followed her everywhere. During church services, older women studied her with the fascinated pity usually reserved for widows who had lost everything in fires. After Sunday sermons, wives gathered near the vestry entrance and lowered their voices the moment Leora walked past. Such a waste, one woman murmured behind her hymnal during a harvest festival service. She was quite admired once, if you can believe it. Her companion shook her head sadly. Beauty only holds the door open for so long. Eventually it closes whether you have walked through or not. Leora kept walking as though she had heard nothing. She had become remarkably skilled at hearing nothing. At home, the cruelty arrived without disguise. Cressida, the second eldest at 27, treated Leora with the casual contempt of someone who believed her own beauty guaranteed a brilliant future. Venetia, 25 and already attracting serious courtship interest from several titled families, perfected the art of sympathy that cut deeper than open insults. And Perdita, the youngest at 22, possessed the particular boldness of a woman who had never once experienced rejection. One October evening, while Leora carried a tray of warmed cider through the drawing room toward guests gathered near the fireplace, Perdita glanced up from her embroidery with theatrical surprise. "Goodness, Leora, you really have perfected the servant's walk. Even the way you hold the tray looks entirely natural now." Cressida smiled into her wine glass. Venetia turned her face toward the window, though her shoulders trembled with suppressed laughter. Leora placed the tray down carefully, adjusted the cups, and walked away without a single word. Behind her, the laughter she was never meant to hear followed her through the corridor and up the stairs into the silence of her bedroom. That night, rain tapped against the windows while Leora sat at her small writing desk, staring at nothing. Beneath the desk drawer, hidden where nobody ever looked, rested a bundle of old letters tied with faded ribbon. She did not open them anymore. She had not opened them in years, but knowing they existed beneath her fingers still mattered in ways she could not explain to anyone. Downstairs, Lord Harland's voice carried through the study door while he spoke with Lady Margot over evening brandy. Cressida's courtship with Sir Aldous Pemberton is progressing exactly as planned. Lord Cavendish Hale has shown considerable interest in Venetia. Even Perdita has attracted serious attention already. "And Leora?" Lady Margot asked quietly. A long silence followed. Leora is no longer part of that conversation. The words reached the upstairs corridor where Leora stood motionless in the darkness, one hand resting against the cold wall. She remained there for a very long time before returning to her room and closing the door without making a sound. The transformation of Ashgrove Manor began 6 weeks before Cressida's engagement celebration and consumed the entire household like a fever. Carriages arrived daily from London carrying enormous wooden crates packed with imported candelabras, bolts of ivory silk, crystal wine glasses wrapped individually in cotton cloth, and silver serving platters engraved with the Ashgrove family crest. The ballroom, usually closed during autumn months, was thrown open and scrubbed until the marble floors reflected candlelight like polished mirrors. Painters arrived to touch up the ceiling murals. Carpenters rebuilt the small stage where musicians would perform. Florists from 3 different counties delivered roses, peonies, and trailing ivy that perfumed the entire ground floor until the air felt almost intoxicating. Lord Harland supervised every detail with obvious pride. Cressida's engagement to Sir Aldous Pemberton represented exactly the kind of alliance he had spent decades cultivating. The Pemberton family controlled textile factories across the northern counties and maintained close friendships with several members of Parliament. Their wealth was new compared to the Ashgrove name, but Lord Harland understood perfectly well that ancient names without modern fortunes eventually crumbled into irrelevance. Lady Margot coordinated the guest list with military precision, while Cressida floated through fitting after fitting, trying gowns shipped from a dressmaker in Paris who had once sewn for minor European royalty. The responsibility for making everything actually function fell predictably onto Leora. She rose before sunrise each morning during those 6 weeks. She inspected every guest bedroom to ensure linens were pressed and fresh lavender sachets rested inside each pillow. She mediated arguments between exhausted kitchen workers who disagreed about pastry recipes. She corrected errors in the seating chart that would have placed feuding families directly across from each other. She counted silverware, tested candle heights, approved wine selections, tasted soups, adjusted curtain ties, replaced cracked flower vases, and ensured that firewood supplies were stocked in every hearth throughout the manor. Her hands ached constantly. Her sleep dwindled to 4 or 5 hours each night. Dark circles deepened beneath her eyes while exhaustion settled into her bones like winter damp. Nobody thanked her once. Cressida swept through the manor like a woman already crowned. She criticized flower arrangements without understanding how long they had taken to assemble. She demanded tablecloth replacements after spotting imperfections invisible to anyone else. She complained about candle scents, wine temperatures, chair cushion firmness, and the angle at which napkins were folded beside each place setting. One afternoon, 5 days before the celebration, Cressida paused beside Leora in the corridor while servants carried stacked chairs behind them. "The ivory ribbons along the east staircase are uneven," she announced without greeting. "Honestly, Leora, if you cannot manage something as simple as ribbons, perhaps we should hire someone who can." Leora adjusted the ribbons herself within the hour. 3 days before the event, Lady Margot pulled Leora aside in the morning room with an expression that attempted warmth but achieved only instruction. "You will oversee the serving staff personally during the celebration. Cressida cannot be distracted by household concerns on her evening." Of course, Lady Margot hesitated briefly, then added in a softer voice that somehow stung worse than coldness, "You are so wonderfully organized, Leora. It really is your finest quality." The compliment landed like a verdict. Organization. Not beauty, not charm, not grace. Organization. The quality valued in housekeepers and estate managers, not in daughters. The evening of the celebration arrived wrapped in cold November fog. Hundreds of candles illuminated the ballroom, casting golden warmth across tables overflowing with roasted venison glazed in blackberry sauce, buttered parsnips, creamed leeks, poached salmon arranged on beds of watercress, warm bread rolls dusted with rosemary, and towering displays of sugared fruits and miniature lemon tarts. Musicians played softly beside the marble staircase while guests arrived in waves of perfumed silk and polished leather boots. Cressida entered the ballroom wearing pale gold satin trimmed with seed pearls that caught the candlelight with every step. Diamond earrings borrowed from Lady Margot rested against her throat while her dark hair was swept into an elaborate arrangement decorated with tiny white flowers. Sir Aldous Pemberton stood beside her, tall and smiling with the easy confidence of a man who understood his own value precisely. Leora stood near the musicians, wearing the same navy blue gown she had worn to every formal event for the past 2 years. She directed servants quietly, ensuring wine glasses remained full and empty plates vanished before guests noticed them. She moved through the ballroom like someone designed to be functional rather than seen. Halfway through the evening, she slipped briefly into the kitchen corridor to check whether the dessert trays were ready. Near the scullery entrance, little Posy, the cook's youngest daughter, sat hunched on an overturned bucket, crying silently while cradling her right hand against her chest. The child had burned herself carrying a tray of heated serving spoons too heavy for her small arms. Leora knelt beside her immediately. "Let me see." "Sweetheart." The girl flinched, but Leora's voice was so gentle that the small fingers uncurled slowly, revealing an angry red mark across the palm. Leora soaked a clean cloth in cool water from the basin and wrapped the burned hand carefully while whispering reassurances until the crying softened into hiccups. She produced a sugared biscuit from the dessert tray beside them and placed it into the child's uninjured hand. "Do not tell the cook," Leora whispered with a small smile. Posy managed a wet giggle through her tears. Nobody upstairs noticed the eldest daughter of the house had been absent. Nobody ever did. Later that evening, an elderly countess approached her warmly beside the dessert table. "You must be one of the Ashgrove daughters. What a lovely gathering. Tell me, dear, are you also engaged?" Before Leora could respond, Perdita appeared beside her with a crystal glass of champagne and a smile sharper than the rim. "Leora manages the household, Lady Clifton. She is wonderfully talented with domestic arrangements." The countess blinked, clearly recalculating Leora's position within the family. "How practical," she offered politely before drifting away. Perdita winked at Leora and vanished back into the crowd without another word. During supper, the humiliation deepened. Cressida sat beside Sir Aldous at the head of the table, while Lord Harland raised his glass proudly before the assembled guests. "To my daughter Cressida and to Sir Aldous Pemberton, may their union bring strength, honor, and prosperity to both families." Glasses clinked across the room. Applause followed while Cressida beamed radiantly beneath the chandeliers. Then Venetia leaned toward Leora with a gentle expression that fooled everyone watching except Leora herself. Do not feel overlooked, dear sister. I am certain your time will come eventually. Perhaps a widowed clergyman or a retired schoolmaster might still appreciate a woman of your particular qualities. Soft laughter rippled across the nearest tables. Cressida covered her mouth delicately while Perdita studied her wineglass with barely contained amusement. Even Sir Aldous looked briefly uncomfortable before returning his attention to his plate. Leora placed her napkin carefully beside her untouched food and smiled with a steadiness that cost her everything behind her ribs. Thank you, Venetia. That is very kind. Later, after midnight, when the last carriage had departed and the musicians packed their instruments into leather cases, Leora helped the kitchen staff clear the remaining dishes. She carried trays of soiled glasses through the corridor toward the scullery, while exhaustion pressed against her chest like a physical weight. Inside the servants' hallway, she paused near the pantry door after hearing two voices speaking quietly. She organized this entire evening herself. One of the younger maids whispered, every flower, every plate, every candle, and not a single person said thank you. The older cook beside her sighed heavily. That family does not deserve her. They never have. Leora pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. She did not cry. She had stopped crying at events like this long ago. Instead, she stood perfectly still in the darkness while the last candles in the ballroom were extinguished one by one, until the only sound remaining was the rain beginning to fall against the manor windows. Somewhere above her, in the warmest bedroom of the house, Cressida laughed softly about something wonderful while the rest of the family celebrated around her. Leora remained downstairs alone. Long before silence settled permanently inside Leora Ashgrove, there had once been mornings filled with laughter near the stables. At 22, Leora moved through the world with an openness that seemed impossible now. She walked barefoot through the gardens during summer, read poetry aloud near the river while dragonflies hovered above the water, and played the harp beside the library windows during long golden evenings while the scent of honeysuckle drifted through the house. She argued cheerfully with dinner guests about philosophy and literature, surprising older gentlemen who expected nothing but polite agreement from young women. She rode horses across the Ashgrove grounds every morning before breakfast, leaning low against the mane while the countryside blurred beneath her. That was the year Emery Winter arrived at the estate. Emery came accompanying Dr. Hargrove, a respected London physician summoned to treat Lord Harland during a prolonged illness involving severe chest pains that had confined him to bed for several weeks. Emery served as the doctor's apprentice and carried medical supplies, prepared remedies, and took careful notes during each examination. He was 25 years old, quiet in manner, and utterly without social standing. Leora first noticed him in the servants' corridor one afternoon while he knelt beside old Griffith, the elderly groundskeeper, carefully examining the man's swollen knee while speaking to him with a gentleness that stopped Leora mid-step. Most visitors to the estate barely acknowledged servants existed. Emery treated Griffith as though his comfort mattered more than anything else in the room. Their first real conversation happened the following evening inside the library. Leora had been reading when Emery entered looking for a medical reference volume. They spoke for nearly 2 hours about everything except medicine. He described the landscapes he had seen during his travels through the northern counties, the small villages where he had treated farmers who could not afford physicians, and the satisfaction of watching someone recover from illness they believed would end them. Leora described the books that shaped her thinking, the music that moved her most, and the frustration of living inside a world that measured women exclusively by the men who chose them. Nobody had ever listened to her the way Emery listened. He leaned forward when she spoke, asked questions that proved he remembered details from previous conversations, and never once interrupted her to redirect attention toward himself. By the third week, Leora waited for his visits with an anticipation she refused to name aloud. They walked together along the river path beneath canopies of autumn leaves turning copper and gold. He brought her wildflowers pressed between pages of his medical journals. She played the harp for him one evening while rain fell softly outside, and when she finished, the silence between them held a warmth that neither of them needed to explain. For the first time in her life, Leora felt chosen for something deeper than appearance or family name. He saw the restlessness beneath her composure. He saw the intelligence she had learned to soften around men who found it threatening. He saw her entirely. Even Nell, the young housemaid who had served Leora since childhood, noticed the change immediately. "You are humming again," Nell whispered one morning while helping Leora dress for breakfast. "You stopped humming years ago." Leora smiled and said nothing, but the blush that warmed her cheeks answered clearly enough. Happiness inside Ashgrove Manor never survived discovery. One rain-soaked evening, Lord Harland returned unexpectedly to the library after recovering enough to resume walking the estate and found Leora and Emery seated together near the fire. Emery had been reading aloud from a volume of verse while Leora listened with an expression that revealed everything she had tried to conceal. Lord Harland said nothing in the library. He waited until that night. His voice carried through the study walls with a force that made servants freeze in the corridor outside. You entered my home under professional obligation and used that access to pursue my daughter. Do you understand what that means for a man of your position? Emery stood without flinching. I love her, my lord. That is not an offense, love. Lord Harland pronounced the word as though it carried disease. Love does not maintain estates. Love does not protect reputations built across 5 generations. You offer my daughter nothing except poverty dressed in pleasant conversation. Leora begged from the doorway. She pleaded with her father to listen, to consider character above title, to understand that genuine feeling held value beyond financial calculation. Lord Harland refused to look at her while he spoke. This discussion ended before it began. Lady Margot supported the decision quietly the following morning, her voice calm but immovable. People already watch this family carefully, Leora. A physician's apprentice would confirm every suspicion they already hold about your judgment. Emery was ordered to leave by noon. Leora found him standing near the front gate beneath heavy gray skies while a hired carriage waited on the gravel. Drive. Rain had already soaked through his coat, but he stood perfectly still, holding both of her hands between his own. I will find a way back to you, he said quietly. I will build something worthy of their demands, no matter how long it requires. Please wait for me. Leora watched the carriage disappear beyond the tree line at the edge of the estate. She stood at the gate until the sound of wheels faded completely, and then she stood there longer still, as though remaining in that exact spot might somehow prevent the distance from becoming permanent. Months passed without letters. Autumn turned to winter. Frost covered the garden paths she had once walked beside him while silence replaced every space his voice had occupied. Then the letter arrived. Nell brought it to her room on a gray February morning, her face already heavy with something she could not bring herself to say aloud. Leora opened the envelope with steady hands. She read 3 lines before the page blurred completely. Emery had contracted typhus while treating patients in a coastal village in the north. He had died 11 days before the letter reached her. The teacup resting on her nightstand slipped from the edge where her trembling hand had knocked it and shattered across the wooden floor. Leora stared at the broken pieces without moving. She locked herself inside her bedroom for 5 days afterward. She refused food. She refused visitors. She refused sunlight by drawing the curtains so tightly that noon looked identical to midnight. When she finally emerged, something behind her eyes had changed permanently. The young woman who once hummed while dressing for breakfast and rode horses at dawn and argued passionately about poetry during dinner had quietly disappeared. In her place stood someone who had learned that wanting things too deeply inside, Ashgrove Manor only guaranteed they would be taken away. The years following Emery's death passed through Leora like seasons crossing an empty field, changing the light without altering anything beneath the surface. She stopped playing the harp entirely. The instrument gathered dust inside the music room while nobody asked why it had fallen silent. She stopped riding in the mornings. The stable hands eventually reassigned her favorite mare to Perdita, who complained about the animal's temperament within a week. Leora stopped volunteering opinions during dinner conversations, and slowly, so gradually that nobody noticed the exact moment it happened, she stopped being addressed at all. Meanwhile, the Ashgrove household celebrated. Venetia's engagement to Lord Cavendish Hale arrived with the quiet precision of a political treaty rather than a love story. Lord Cavendish possessed old wealth, vast estates in the eastern counties, and a reputation inside Parliament that Lord Harland considered more valuable than any dowry. The man himself carried an expression of permanent calculation behind polite smiles and spoke about his future wife with the same measured enthusiasm he reserved for discussing land tax reform. During the engagement dinner, held inside the formal dining room beneath freshly polished chandeliers, Lord Cavendish addressed the table with practiced composure while Venetia sat beside him looking beautiful and entirely uncertain. I believe strong alliances between families serve the nation as surely as any act of parliament, he declared while raising his glass. To partnership. Not love, not devotion, not even affection, partnership. Several guests exchanged brief glances, but applause followed anyway. Leora sat at the far end of the table, positioned between an elderly baronet who had fallen asleep beside his soup and an empty chair that had been meant for a guest who never arrived. Nobody had adjusted the seating to remove the gap. She simply existed beside absence, as though the arrangement felt natural to everyone involved. After supper, Venetia approached her near the hallway with the practiced tenderness that always preceded her cruelest observations. "I want you to know that I think about your situation often, Leora. It must be terribly difficult watching everyone around you move forward." Leora studied her sister's face carefully before answering. "Thank you for your concern, Venetia." Venetia squeezed her hand with gentle pressure. "I simply cannot imagine carrying that kind of loneliness year after year. You really are remarkably brave." She released Leora's hand and floated back toward the drawing room, leaving behind the faint scent of French perfume and the precise wound she had intended to deliver. 14 months later, Perdita's engagement to Phineas Thorne exploded across the household with the force of a celebration that refused to acknowledge its own excess. Phineas Thorne had inherited an industrial empire spanning iron foundries, railway investments, and shipping warehouses along the southern coast. He was handsome in the aggressive way of men who understood their own wealth enhanced their appearance considerably. He smiled frequently, complimented Perdita publicly with theatrical devotion, and purchased a diamond ring so extravagant that Lady Margot gasped audibly when Perdita displayed it during afternoon tea. "He spent nearly £6,000 on this stone alone," Perdita announced, while rotating her hand beneath the window light so every facet caught the sun. The youngest Ashgrove daughter had never learned the difference between admiration and envy, and she pursued both with equal enthusiasm. The engagement celebration consumed the manor for weeks. Leora managed every detail once again. She supervised the construction of a temporary garden pavilion draped in white silk. She coordinated menus with a chef hired from London. She resolved a crisis involving misdelivered wine shipments at 3 o'clock in the morning, while the rest of the household slept. By the evening of the celebration, exhaustion had hollowed her face visibly. Dark circles sat beneath her eyes like bruises, while her shoulders carried the particular tension of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. The ballroom looked magnificent. Hundreds of candles reflected against crystal glasses and silver cutlery, while the scent of roasted lamb, honeyed carrots, warm bread, and cinnamon-dusted pastries filled the air. Musicians played beneath garlands of white roses and trailing ivy, while guests arrived wearing jewels that glittered against the golden light like scattered stars. Perdita wore ivory silk that seemed to float around her as she drifted through the ballroom beside Phineas, whose possessive hand never left the small of her back. Cressida attended with Sir Aldous, though Leora noticed Cressida's smile had grown thinner in recent months, and her husband's eyes wandered toward the wine table with increasing frequency. Venetia arrived beside Lord Cavendish, who spent the majority of the evening discussing tariff legislation with Lord Harland, while his wife sat silently beside an untouched glass of champagne. During supper, Perdita stood and raised her crystal glass with the assurance of someone who had never once considered that attention might not belong to her. Automatically. 3 daughters married brilliantly, she declared, with shining eyes, turning toward Lord Harland. 3 successful alliances for the Ashgrove name. Lord Harland lifted his glass with unmistakable pride to the future of this family. Glasses clinked across the room. Nobody corrected the number. Nobody acknowledged that 4 daughters existed inside the Ashgrove family and only 3 had been counted. The absence of Leora's name hung over the table like a chair removed before guests arrived, noticeable only to those willing to look at the empty space. Cressida leaned forward with a smile balanced perfectly between sympathy and satisfaction. Poor Leora, always the bridesmaid standing at the back of the church. Venetia tilted her head. Not even the bridesmaid, really. More the woman who arranges the flowers before the ceremony begins. Perdita laughed brightly while several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Leora placed her fork down beside her plate with absolute care, as though the precise angle of the silverware mattered more than anything else in the room. She excused herself with a smile that cost her the last reserve of composure she possessed, and walked out of the ballroom before anyone could see what was breaking behind her expression. She made it as far as the garden wall before the tears came. Rain had begun falling sometime during supper, and cold water struck her face and shoulders as she pressed both hands flat against the wet stone and bent forward, struggling to breathe through the pressure collapsing inside her chest. She had survived years of whispered pity, public mockery, and quiet exclusion. She had survived grief that nearly destroyed her entirely. But hearing her own father toast 3 daughters as though the 4th did not exist, broke something that silence and composure could no longer hold. together. Inside the manor, through the rain and the stone and the distance, she heard laughter continuing without her. Later that night, long after Leora had dried her face and returned to her bedroom without anyone noticing her absence, she overheard Lord Harland speaking with Lady Margot through the partially open study door. "I have written to your sister in Devonshire. The cottage near the coast remains available. Leora could relocate quietly before the next season begins." Lady Margot's was silent for a moment. "People have begun to talk, Harland. Her presence here raises questions we cannot answer comfortably anymore." "Then it is decided," Lord Harland replied. "The sooner the better." Leora stood frozen in the darkened corridor, her hand pressed flat against the wall for balance. They were sending her away. Not because she had failed at anything. Not because she had shamed the family through scandal or recklessness. Simply because her existence, unmarried and unmatched, embarrassed them too deeply to tolerate any longer. She returned to her bedroom and sat on the edge of her bed without lighting a candle. The bundle of Emery's letters still rested beneath the writing desk drawer where she had kept them for years. She did not reach for them tonight. Tonight, even memory felt like something she no longer deserved. Across the western counties of England, the name Soren Vale carried a weight that most men spent entire lifetimes failing to accumulate. His estates stretched across 3 counties, encompassing thousands of acres of ancient woodland, working farmland, iron quarries, and a private harbor that generated more annual revenue than several smaller noble families combined. Dunmarron Hall, his ancestral seat, stood on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, where storms rolled inland with a violence that matched the reputation of the man who lived there. The house itself was enormous. Dark granite walls rose 4 stories above gardens that remained wild and uncultivated by deliberate choice, as though the Duke preferred his surroundings to reflect honesty rather than performance. Inside, vast corridors lined with oak paneling connected rooms filled with books, maps, navigational instruments, and paintings collected by 4 generations of Vales who had built their fortune through shipping, industry, and an instinct for commerce that aristocratic society simultaneously envied and resented. At 38 years old, Duke Soren Vale had become one of the most powerful men in England. Politicians consulted him privately before proposing trade legislation. Bankers adjusted interest rates after studying his investment patterns. Military officials respected his judgment on naval matters because the Vale shipping fleet had provided vessels during wartime more than once. Yet for all his influence, Soren Vale was known primarily for 2 things. The first was his absolute refusal to participate in the social rituals that governed aristocratic life. He declined invitations to balls, ignored requests for introductions from ambitious families, and attended Parliament only when legislation directly affected his commercial interests. London society considered him impossibly difficult. Mothers with eligible daughters considered him a challenge worth any humiliation. The second thing Soren Vale was known for was Tempest. The black stallion had arrived at Dunmarron Hall 3 years earlier, purchased from a breeder in the north who warned the Duke's stable master that the animal had never accepted a rider and had injured 2 trainers, severely enough to end their careers. Soren purchased the horse anyway after watching it for less than 5 minutes. Something about the animal's refusal to submit fascinated him in ways he never explained to anyone. Tempest stood 17 hands tall with a coat so dark it appeared almost blue in certain light. His eyes carried an intelligence that unsettled experienced horsemen, and his temperament shifted between absolute stillness and explosive violence. Without warning, the finest trainers in England had attempted to break the stallion over the following years. Each one failed. Several left Dunmarron Hall with broken bones. One departed with a shattered collarbone and a firm declaration that the animal was not trainable by any method known to professional horsemanship. Soren kept the horse. He visited the stable every evening and stood outside the stall without entering, watching the animal pace and stamp in the lantern light. Servants whispered that the Duke saw something of himself in the creature. A stable boy once said it more plainly. "They are the same," he muttered to another groom while cleaning tack late one evening. Both of them decided a long time ago that trusting people was not worth the cost. The boy was not entirely wrong. 7 years earlier, London society had celebrated the courtship between Duke Soren Vale and Lady Ravenna Lacroix as the most anticipated union of the decade. Ravenna possessed the kind of beauty that silenced rooms. Her dark auburn hair caught candlelight in ways that made other women instinctively touch their own and reconsider their choices. Her conversation balanced wit, warmth, and flattery so skillfully that men frequently forgot they were being managed. Soren had believed her completely. During their courtship, he opened parts of himself that years of guarded living had sealed shut. He shared his private fears about inheriting responsibilities that consumed every waking hour. He described the loneliness of a man surrounded constantly by people who wanted his influence but never his company. Ravenna listened with tears forming in her beautiful eyes, and told him she understood him in ways nobody else ever could. He gifted her sapphire earrings that had belonged to his grandmother. He funded repairs to her family's crumbling estate without being asked, interpreting the need as an opportunity to demonstrate devotion rather than recognizing it as calculated positioning. The discovery arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Soren had returned to Ravenna's family estate unexpectedly after a business meeting concluded. Inside the garden conservatory, he found letters stacked carelessly inside a writing case on the side table. 18 letters exchanged over 14 months with Lord Desmond Calloway, written in language that left no ambiguity about the nature of their relationship. The affair had continued throughout the entirety of their courtship. Every intimate conversation Soren had shared with Ravenna had been repeated to Desmond in mocking detail. One letter described Soren as useful but exhausting. Another referred to his emotional openness as almost embarrassingly sincere for a man of his position. Their final conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. "You were never going to choose me," Soren said quietly, his voice carrying no anger, only the flat certainty of someone confirming something he should have recognized months earlier. Ravenna did not deny it. Instead, she studied him with an expression balanced between guilt and something uncomfortably close to pity. "You offered security, Soren." Desmond offered excitement. "Surely you understand the difference." He left without responding. The humiliation that followed proved worse than the betrayal itself. London society absorbed the scandal eagerly. Noble women whispered behind opera glasses while gentlemen exchanged knowing glances at their clubs. The powerful Duke of Dunmarin, fooled completely by a beautiful woman exploiting his loneliness, he withdrew almost entirely after that season. Dunmarin Hall became a fortress of silence where business continued efficiently, but human connection stopped at the estate gates. Women pursued him relentlessly regardless. Ambitious mothers manufactured chance encounters at the rare events he attended. Young noble women performed elaborate displays of charm and availability whenever he entered a room. He responded to all of them with the same polite distance that society interpreted as coldness, and that Soren understood simply as self-preservation. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Heloise, watched the isolation deepen with growing alarm. She visited Dunmarin Hall one winter evening and found her son sitting alone beside the study fire with an untouched supper tray on the desk. "You cannot build walls around yourself forever and call it wisdom," she said gently while settling into the chair across from him. Soren continued reading without looking up. "I am not building walls, I am recognizing patterns." Heloise studied her son's face carefully. The sharpness that had once been confidence had calcified into something harder and more permanent over the years. Exhaustion lived permanently beneath his eyes. She was one woman, Soren, not a verdict on the entire world. He glanced toward the rain-covered windows overlooking the black Atlantic cliffs beyond the garden. "She was the one I trusted completely. That makes the verdict accurate enough." Heloise left that evening carrying a fear she could not express to anyone. She feared her son would spend the remainder of his life surrounded by wealth, influence, and respect, yet completely alone inside the walls of an estate that grew colder with every passing winter. Weeks later, a formal invitation arrived from Lord Harland Ashgrove, requesting the Duke's presence at an autumn exhibition of fine horses hosted at the Ashgrove estate. Several breeders and trainers of significant reputation planned to attend, and Lord Harland, who had been cultivating a commercial relationship with Vale shipping interests for months, had extended the invitation with particular emphasis on the Duke's attendance. Soren would have ignored it under ordinary circumstances. But the Ashgrove shipping contract represented considerable value, and refusing entirely risked offending a man whose political connections were becoming increasingly useful. He stared at the invitation for several long moments beside the study window while rain streaked across the glass. "Prepare the carriage," he told his valet without expression, "and bring Tempest. If Lord Ashgrove wishes to exhibit fine horses, he may as well see one worth discussing." The valet hesitated. "The Stallion, Your Grace. Are you certain that is wise?" Soren folded the invitation and placed it inside his coat. "I did not say it was wise, I said to bring the horse." The morning of the Ashgrove Autumn Horse Exhibition arrived beneath skies heavy with the kind of pale silver clouds that threatened rain without delivering it. Servants had worked through the night preparing the estate grounds. White canvas pavilions stretched along the south lawn where guests could observe the exhibition paddock while drinking champagne and eating chilled, oysters, smoked trout, and delicate finger sandwiches. Grooms in polished boots led thoroughbreds along the gravel paths while breeders discussed bloodlines with the authority of men who believed horses existed primarily to prove their owner's importance. Lord Harlan moved through the crowd with visible satisfaction. Several members of Parliament attended. 2 banking families had sent representatives. The guest list read like an inventory of commercial opportunity. Leora had overseen every preparation naturally. She had organized the catering, coordinated stable schedules, and managed overnight guest accommodations. By the time guests began arriving, her hands ached and exhaustion pressed behind her eyes like a dull headache that refused to lift. She stood near the far end of the paddock fence, deliberately positioned away from the main gathering, wearing the same dark blue dress she wore to every public event. Her sisters occupied prominent positions beneath the central pavilion beside their husbands, dressed in silk and jewels that caught the autumn light brilliantly. Lady Margot circulated among guests with rehearsed grace, while Lord Harland personally greeted every visitor of consequence. Nobody greeted Leora. She had not expected them to. The atmosphere shifted shortly before midday when a large black carriage appeared on the main drive, followed by a separate horse transport that drew immediate attention from every groom and breeder on the grounds. Word spread through the gathering with visible electricity. The Duke of Dunmarron has arrived. He has brought the stallion. Conversations paused across the lawn. Lord Harland straightened his coat and moved toward the entrance with an urgency he normally reserved for political emergencies. Lady Margot gripped Cressida's arm with sudden intensity. "Stand tall, all of you. Smile. Do not appear nervous." Soren Vale stepped down from his carriage without ceremony. He wore a dark riding coat that emphasized the severity of his expression, while his sharp eyes surveyed the estate grounds with detached assessment. He greeted Lord Harland with formal courtesy that carried no warmth beyond professional obligation. Behind him, stable hands carefully guided Tempest from the horse transport using long lead ropes held at cautious distance. The stallion emerged into daylight with a presence that silenced the nearest spectators immediately. His black coat gleamed with the deep sheen of polished obsidian while muscles shifted visibly beneath the skin with every step. Within the hour, the exhibition's original program had been quietly abandoned. Every guest wanted to see Tempest. Several confident gentlemen wanted to prove they could handle the animal that had reportedly defeated every professional trainer in England. The first man, a cavalry officer with 15 years of experience, entered the paddock with calm authority and extended his hand toward the stallion. S-muzzle Tempest remained motionless until the man stepped within arm's reach, then exploded sideways with such violence that the officer stumbled backward over the fence railing while spectators gasped. A second man tried speaking softly while approaching from the left. The stallion kicked the wooden mounting block across the ring with enough force to crack it in half. A third brought sugar cubes and gentle words. Tempest reared so dramatically that 2 women in the pavilion screamed and spilled champagne across their dresses. By the 6th failed attempt, nervous laughter had replaced genuine confidence. Men joked about the animal being possessed while secretly nursing bruised pride. Soren watched from beside the fence with an expression that betrayed nothing, though something that might have been grim satisfaction flickered briefly across his features. Lord Harland shook his head beside his wife. Magnificent creature, but completely ungovernable. Perdita leaned toward Cressida with amusement sharpening her voice. "Perhaps they should send Leora into the ring. She has nothing else to occupy her time." Cressida laughed. Venetia turned away to hide her smile behind a gloved hand. Between attempts, a loud crash drew attention near the refreshment pavilion. A young servant carrying a tray stacked with crystal champagne flutes had caught her foot against a tent rope and fallen hard onto the grass. Glass shattered in every direction while pale liquid soaked across the white tablecloth draped over the display table. The girl lay trembling among the broken shards, too frightened to move, while several nearby guests stepped backward with expressions of sharp irritation. "Clumsy thing," one woman muttered while brushing champagne droplets from her sleeve. Before anyone else reacted, Leora was already kneeling beside the girl. "Careful, do not move your hands. There is glass everywhere." She spoke quietly enough that only the servant could hear, gently lifting the girl's wrist to check for cuts while shielding her from the disapproving stares with her own body. A thin line of blood ran across the girl's palm. Leora wrapped it firmly with a handkerchief from her own pocket and helped her stand, guiding her away from the broken glass toward the kitchen entrance with one arm steadying the girl's shaking shoulders. Nobody applauded. Nobody commented. The guests returned their attention to the paddock within seconds. But from across the exhibition grounds, Soren Vale had watched every moment without blinking. Nobody noticed Leora leave her position near the far fence shortly afterward. She had not planned to approach the paddock. She had been walking toward the kitchen entrance to check on the afternoon refreshment service when the sound of the stallion's distressed breathing stopped her near the side gate. The animal stood alone in the center of the ring, trembling with agitation after the seventh stranger had attempted to force a bridle over his head. Sweat darkened his flanks while his nostrils flared rapidly with each breath. Leora stood at the gate watching the horse for a long moment. Then, without conscious decision, she unfastened the latch quietly and stepped inside the paddock. She did not walk toward the stallion. She simply stood still, several paces inside the ring, with her hands resting openly at her sides. She did not speak. She did not extend her hand or make any gesture of approach. She breathed slowly and waited. The stallion's ears shifted forward. His rapid breathing began to slow. For nearly 36 seconds, neither of them moved. Then Tempest turned his massive body and walked, slowly, deliberately, across the paddock, past the broken mounting block, past the scattered sugar cubes and abandoned lead ropes, directly toward the woman standing quietly near the gate with nothing in her hands except stillness. The stallion stopped less than a foot from Leora and lowered his great dark head until his muzzle rested gently against her open palm. The exhibition grounds fell completely silent. Soren Vale stared from across the paddock without blinking. Something behind his ribs shifted with a force he had not felt in 7 years. Every woman at this exhibition had performed for his attention since the moment he arrived. Every man had demonstrated confidence and control designed to impress him. And the only person who had moved the untouchable creature was the same woman who had knelt beside a frightened servant minutes earlier, wearing a faded dress, who had not been trying to impress anyone at all. In the days following the exhibition, something changed inside the Ashgrove household with a speed that made Leora feel as though she had stepped through a door into a house she did not recognize. It began with the visits. Duke Soren Vale returned to the Ashgrove estate 4 days after the exhibition, requesting a brief meeting with Lord Harland regarding shipping contracts. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. Afterward, Soren asked whether Miss Ashgrove might be available for a short walk through the grounds, as he wished to discuss the methods she had used to approach his stallion. Lord Harland nearly knocked over his brandy glass in his eagerness to arrange it. They walked for over an hour along the river path, while autumn leaves drifted across the water around them. Leora explained honestly that she had used no method at all. She had simply recognized an animal overwhelmed by noise, aggression, and unfamiliar hands, and had offered him the opposite: silence, patience, the absence of demand. Soren listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for several paces before speaking. Most people believe strength requires force. You seem to understand that it sometimes requires the opposite. Leora glanced at him, surprised by the weight behind such a simple observation. I believe frightened creatures respond to safety, not control. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but the careful loosening of something held deliberately rigid for a very long time. He returned 3 days later, then again the following week, then twice during the week after that. Each visit lasted longer than the one before. Servants began preparing his preferred tea before his carriage even appeared on the main drive. Their conversations carried none of the performance Soren had grown to expect from social interaction. Leora never mentioned his wealth, his title, or his influence inside Parliament. She spoke about books she was reading, music she missed playing, and the particular satisfaction of watching bread rise properly during early morning baking. She asked him questions about his shipping routes with genuine curiosity rather than calculated flattery, and when he described the loneliness of managing an enormous estate alone, she did not offer sympathy designed to position herself as the solution. She simply listened and said quietly that loneliness was something she understood without needing it explained. The honesty disarmed him more completely than any practiced charm ever could. London society noticed quickly. Newspapers printed subtle remarks about the Duke of Dunmarin's repeated visits to a minor county estate, speculating about commercial interests while clearly implying romantic ones. Gossip traveled through drawing rooms and opera halls with astonishing speed. Surely he cannot seriously admire the eldest Ashgrove daughter. She is 30 and entirely unremarkable. Perhaps he pities her. Powerful men sometimes enjoy rescuing women beneath their station. No sensible person visits a woman that frequently without serious intention. Inside Ashgrove Manor, the transformation bordered on absurd. Lord Harland suddenly included Leora in conversations with important guests, introducing her with a pride that would have been unrecognizable 3 months earlier. He asked her opinions about household matters at dinner, as though her judgment had always been valued rather than invisible. Lady Margot's change proved even more dramatic. Expensive gowns arrived from London weekly, deep emerald silk, pale rose satin embroidered with silver thread, and ivory lace gloves trimmed with tiny freshwater pearls filled Leora's wardrobe while her mother supervised every fitting personally. The Duke notices refinement. Lady Margot insisted one afternoon while adjusting a pearl necklace around Leora's throat. You must present yourself accordingly. Leora studied her own reflection with a look caught between gratitude and something considerably more painful. 2 months ago, this same woman had agreed to send her to a coastal cottage in Devonshire to avoid embarrassment. Now she stood fussing over pearl placements, as though her eldest daughter had always been the family's greatest treasure. The affection felt less like love and more like strategy wearing a different dress. Her sisters noticed every change, and they despised every moment of it. Cressida's bitterness had grown considerably worse since discovering Sir Aldous had secretly sold her jewelry to cover gambling debts accumulated at a private club in London. Arguments behind closed doors had become nightly. Venetia's silence at home had deepened into genuine loneliness. Lord Cavendish rarely dined with her anymore, spending most evenings in London without explanation. Perdita's glamorous marriage had revealed its true nature within months. Phineas Thorne controlled her wardrobe, her social calendar, and her friendships with increasing rigidity. The man who had once showered her with compliments now criticized her constantly whenever guests departed. Yet none of the sisters examined their own situations honestly. Resentment pointed in only one direction. One afternoon, the three of them gathered inside the drawing room at Ashgrove Manor while rain streaked across the windows. She engineered this somehow, Cressida muttered while twisting her wineglass between anxious fingers. No man of his standing suddenly notices a woman like Leora without being manipulated into it. Venetia nodded slowly. She plays the innocent so convincingly. Men like the Duke enjoy believing they are rescuing someone helpless. Perdita's voice carried the sharpest edge. She is making fools of all of us. Every time he visits, every time Father parades her before guests, it humiliates everything we achieved through our own marriages. The irony of that statement passed all three of them completely. The sabotage began quietly enough that Leora did not recognize it until the damage had already spread. Cressida initiated the campaign during a luncheon at Lady Whitmore's estate, where she casually mentioned to several influential women that her eldest sister had developed a peculiar obsession with the Duke of Dunmarron and had begun manufacturing reasons for him to visit the family home. The suggestion carried no open accusation, only the careful implication that Leora's behavior bordered on desperate. Within days, variations of the story circulated through every significant drawing room in the county. Some versions painted Leora as calculating. Others described her as pathetic. The kindest interpretation still framed her as a woman grasping at her final opportunity with unseemly determination. Venetia contributed more subtly. During a formal dinner in London attended by several families connected to the Vale shipping interests, she arranged for Lady Ravenna Lacroix to receive a last-minute invitation. Ravenna arrived wearing black velvet and rubies that glittered against her throat like drops of frozen fire. Her entrance redirected the attention of every person in the room, and she swept through the gathering with the unhurried poise of a woman who understood precisely how much power her beauty still carried. Throughout the evening, Ravenna positioned herself near Soren with practiced ease. She touched his arm briefly while referencing shared memories from their courtship years and leaned closer than propriety suggested. Leora watched from across the room, seated between two elderly gentlemen discussing crop rotation. She said nothing. She asked nothing. But something tightened painfully inside her chest as she watched the most beautiful woman she had ever seen speak to the man whose visits had become the only part of her week she looked forward to. Then Ravenna leaned toward Soren with an expression of tender concern. You seem different lately. Soren, softer somehow. I worry that someone may be taking advantage of your loneliness. Soren's expression did not change, but his voice dropped to a temperature that made nearby conversation pause. You confuse loneliness with standards, Ravenna. Mine simply improved after you demonstrated exactly what I should avoid. The rejection landed visibly. Ravenna's composure fractured for a single second before she recovered her smile and drifted away from him without another word. Across the room, Venetia's expression tightened with frustration. 3 days later, Soren visited Ashgrove Manor unexpectedly to retrieve estate documents he had left in Lord Harland's study during a previous meeting. The household was not expecting him, and as he walked through the corridor past the drawing room, familiar voices stopped him completely. Cress's words carried clearly through the partially open door. She follows him around like a lost animal hoping for scraps. It is painful to watch. A woman her age should understand when attention is given from pity rather than interest. Perdita laughed sharply. The Duke will grow bored within the season. Men like him always do, and when he leaves, she will have humiliated the entire family even more thoroughly than her spinsterhood already has. Venetia's voice came quieter but no less precise. Perhaps once this infatuation ends, Father will finally send her to Devonshire where she belongs. Soren stood rigid in the corridor. His jaw tightened until the muscles along his neck became visible. Then he pushed the door open without knocking. The three sisters froze as though the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in a single heartbeat. Soren's voice remained controlled, but every word carried the kind of authority that made powerful men reconsider their positions during parliamentary debates. I have listened to enough. What precisely has Miss Ashgrove done to deserve this cruelty from her own family? Nobody spoke. Cressida's wineglass trembled in her hand. Perdita stared at the carpet with sudden intensity. Venetia pressed her lips together, so tightly they nearly disappeared. Soren continued without raising his voice. She organized every celebration in this household without receiving a single word of gratitude. She endured public humiliation with more grace than anyone in this room has demonstrated in private. She treated servants with respect that most of you cannot manage toward your own sister. Lord Harland appeared in the doorway behind Soren, having heard the commotion from his study. Lady Margot stood beside him, her face pale with the particular expression of someone watching consequences arrive for choices they had hoped would remain invisible. Soren looked directly at Lord Harland. You raised a daughter with more dignity, more patience, and more genuine character than any woman I have encountered in 20 years of navigating this society. And you treated her as though those qualities made her worthless because they could not be exchanged for a title or a fortune. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of rain striking the windows filled the room like a pulse. Soren turned and walked out before anyone attempted a response. He found Leora an hour later. She had retreated to the garden bench near the old stone wall where wild climbing roses grew untended because nobody except Leora ever visited that corner of the grounds. Rain had stopped falling, but moisture still clung to every surface. Her eyes were red, but she was no longer crying when he reached her. She had heard enough through the open windows to understand what had happened. No one has ever spoken for me before, she said quietly without looking at him. Her voice carried the exhausted disbelief of someone who had stopped expecting protection so long ago that receiving it felt almost frightening. Soren sat beside her on the wet bench without concern for his coat. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Rain dripped steadily from the rose thorns above them, while the garden held its breath around two people who had both spent years believing that trusting another person was the most dangerous thing a heart could do. Then Leora turned toward him. Why do you keep returning here? Soren studied her face for several seconds before answering. Because you are the only person I have met who has never once tried to become someone other than who they are. Leora's eyes filled again, but she did not look away. The silence between them held a warmth that neither of them needed to explain, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the warmth did not feel like something that would be taken from her. That evening, long after leaving the estate, Soren sat alone inside the study at Dunmerran Hall while firelight moved across the walls. Resting on the desk beside his untouched whiskey glass was a velvet box containing a diamond ring surrounded by pale sapphires that had once belonged to his grandmother. He had purchased the setting 3 weeks ago. He had been carrying the ring with him during every visit to the Ashgrove estate, since, tonight, watching her sit alone on that rain-soaked bench with more composure than most people managed in their finest hours, he understood that the decision had never actually been in question. The only question had been whether he was brave enough to trust again. He closed the velvet box and placed it inside his coat pocket. Then he began writing a letter to Lord Harland Ashgrove. The Harrogate Autumn Ball represented the most prestigious social gathering in the western counties. Held annually inside the grand assembly rooms of Harrogate House, the event attracted nobility, politicians, military officers, and wealthy industrialists from across England. Attendance required formal invitation from the Harrogate Committee, and rejection carried social consequences that ambitious families avoided at nearly any cost. The assembly rooms themselves were designed to overwhelm. Enormous crystal chandeliers descended from ceilings painted with mythological scenes, surrounded by golden clouds. Polished marble floors stretched across 3 interconnected ballrooms where orchestras performed on raised stages. Decorated with white lilies and trailing silver ribbons, Long banquet tables overflowed with roasted venison, braised pheasant, poached lobster, warm bread rolls with salted butter, towers of glazed fruit tarts, and champagne that never stopped flowing. Leora had never attended the Harrogate ball before. Lord Harland had stopped including her on formal invitation lists years ago, deeming her presence an unnecessary complication at events where eligible daughters were expected to attract interest rather than deflect questions about its absence. Tonight was different. Tonight, Lord Harland had personally ensured her name appeared on every document. Lady Margot had dressed her in silver silk embroidered with tiny crystals that caught the light with every movement. Her dark hair was arranged simply without the elaborate constructions her sisters favored, and a single strand of pearls rested against her throat. She looked beautiful in a way that required no decoration to announce itself. Though the old insecurities returned, the moment she stepped inside the crowded ballroom and felt hundreds of eyes evaluate her from every direction. Too old, too plain, too desperate, the whispers she had carried inside her head for years spoke louder than the orchestra. Cressida attended beside Sir Aldous, whose complexion had grown ruddy from drinking and whose wandering attention no longer bothered to conceal itself in public. Venetia arrived with Lord Cavendish, who immediately separated from his wife to join a political discussion near the east fireplace, without looking back. Perdita entered beside Phineas Thorne, whose hand gripped her elbow with a possessiveness that several nearby guests noticed, with visible discomfort. All three sisters watched Leora from across the ballroom with barely concealed hope. They believed tonight, surrounded by younger women of superior beauty, reality would finally reassert itself. Ravenna arrived wearing deep sapphire velvet that made her auburn hair glow beneath the chandeliers. She glided through the assembly with practiced grace, and her eyes found Sorin the moment he entered. The Duke of Dunmoran appeared in the ballroom entrance without announcement. The assembly rooms quieted in waves as his presence registered across the gathering. Noble women straightened. Mothers adjusted daughters' postures with whispered instructions. Ambitious smiles appeared on faces that had been carefully neutral moments before. Sorin wore a dark formal coat that emphasized the sharp authority in his expression. He greeted the Harrogate hosts with brief courtesy and accepted a glass of champagne he did not drink. Women approached him in careful succession. Some praised his estates. Others complimented his political influence. Ravenna positioned herself along his path with practiced patience, her expression composed with quiet expectation. Sorin moved past all of them. Leora stood near the edge of the third ballroom, holding a crystal glass she had not touched, watching the gathering with the quiet resignation of a woman accustomed to occupying spaces without expecting them to make room for her. She had spoken to no one except a servant who had offered her a plate of lobster, which she declined politely. She expected nothing of this evening except survival. Then the crowd shifted. Movement rippled through the ballroom as guests parted instinctively to create a path they did not consciously understand was forming. Sorin had begun walking, slowly, with absolute purpose. In his hand, visible to anyone close enough to notice, rested a small velvet box. Whispers ignited across the assembly rooms like fire catching dry paper. Is he walking toward the Lochry woman? It must be Lady Ravenna. Look at her expression. Ravenna's smile widened carefully as Sorin moved in her direction. For 3 breathless seconds, the entire ballroom believed the Duke of Dunmoran was about to propose to the most beautiful woman in the room. He walked directly past her without a glance. He continued past every celebrated beauty, every ambitious daughter, every carefully positioned smile. The gathering's confusion became audible. Gasps escaped behind fans and gloved hands as the path he followed became unmistakable. He stopped directly before Leora. Complete silence consumed the ballroom. 300 guests held their breath beneath crystal chandeliers that seemed to brighten against the sudden stillness. Leora stared at him. Her fingers trembled against the crystal glass she had forgotten she was holding. Heat rushed across her face while her heartbeat hammered so forcefully she was certain every person nearby could hear it. Sorin opened the velvet box slowly. Inside rested his grandmother's diamond, surrounded by pale sapphires that caught the candlelight and scattered it across Leora's silver gown like fallen stars. Then the wealthiest duke in England spoke words that no one in that ballroom had expected to hear. "Miss Leora Ashgrove," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the silent hall with the steady authority of a man who had never been more certain of anything. "I have spent years surrounded by people who valued beauty above character, wealth above kindness, and status above everything that actually matters." Nobody moved. Sorin's eyes never left hers. "You knelt beside a frightened servant while others stepped away in annoyance. You comforted a burned child in a kitchen while your own family celebrated without noticing your absence. You stood in the rain alone after being humiliated and still returned inside with grace that would have broken anyone who possessed less strength. Cressida's face drained of color entirely. Perdita's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Venetia pressed a trembling hand against her stomach as though absorbing a physical blow. Lady Margot's eyes glistened with something far heavier than pride. A horse that trusted no living person walked to you willingly. Soren continued softly, and in that moment I understood something I had forgotten for a very long time. That trust is not earned through power or beauty or wealth. It is earned through patience, gentleness, and a heart that remains kind after enduring every reason to become otherwise. Tears spilled openly down Leora's cheeks. Her hands shook so violently that the crystal glass slipped from her fingers and would have shattered against the marble floor if a nearby guest had not caught it instinctively. "There is no woman in England I admire more than you," Soren said finally. "And there is no woman I would rather spend the rest of my life beside." He paused. "Leora, will you do me the honor of becoming my duchess?" A broken sound escaped her throat before she could stop it. Years of loneliness, grief, humiliation, and the slow erosion of believing she might never be chosen crashed against her chest simultaneously with such force that standing upright required strength she did not know she still possessed. She pressed her trembling hands against her mouth. Tears ran freely between her fingers while her shoulders shook with emotion too long compressed to release quietly. Then she nodded. Yes. The word barely left her lips before applause erupted across the ballroom with a force that shook the chandeliers above them. Soren slid the ring onto her trembling finger, while 300 guests witnessed the moment that every cruel whisper, every pitying glance, and every year of silence had been building toward. Ravenna turned away sharply and vanished into the crowd without speaking to anyone. Cressida stared at her sister as though looking at someone she had never properly seen before. Perdita lowered her eyes for the first time in her adult life. Lord Harlan stood unmoving beside the banquet table, his expression carrying the stunned weight of a man realizing he had misjudged something fundamental for decades, and Lady Margot's. Lady Margot watched her eldest daughter crying openly in the arms of the most powerful man in England, and the expression on her face held something heavier than shock and more permanent than regret. It held the recognition that she had nearly thrown away the only daughter who had ever truly deserved her pride. Years passed after that evening at Harrogate. As Duchess of Dunmerran, Leora became quietly beloved throughout the western counties, not because of her title or her husband's wealth, but because the kindness she had carried silently inside the Ashgrove household now had room to reach the world beyond its walls. She visited workers' families during harsh winters, bringing food and firewood personally rather than dispatching servants. She remembered the names of stable hands, kitchen maids, and groundskeepers across 3 estates, and they spoke of her with a warmth that no amount of wealth could purchase. She opened parts of Dunmarron Hall to struggling families during storms, and local physicians knew that the Duchess would fund treatment for anyone who could not afford it themselves without requiring gratitude or public recognition in return. Tempest remained at Dunmarron. The great black stallion who had never accepted a rider stood calmly beside Leora whenever she visited the stables, pressing his dark muzzle against her hand, as though the trust he had offered that first afternoon at the exhibition had never wavered. Soren often watched from the stable doorway, still quietly moved by the sight of 2 creatures who had found peace in each other after years of being misunderstood by everyone else. Meanwhile, her sisters' lives unraveled with the slow inevitability of stitches failing in fabric stretched too thin. Sir Aldous Pemberton's gambling debts consumed Cressida's household entirely. Creditors appeared at their estate with increasing frequency, while furniture, jewelry, and silverware disappeared piece by piece to cover losses that multiplied faster than payments could follow. Aldous vanished one autumn morning with a young widow from Bath, leaving Cressida alone inside a house she could no longer afford to heat. Lord Cavendish Hale's political career collapsed after a financial scandal involving misappropriated investment funds. The investigation consumed his reputation, his alliances, and eventually his marriage, as Venetia discovered that the man who had treated her as decoration rather than companion had also concealed debts and dishonesty behind the measured composure she had once mistaken for strength. Phineas Thorne's controlling nature worsened with every passing year until society itself began whispering about the unhappiness visible behind Perdita's increasingly strained smiles. The man who once showered her with diamonds now monitored her letters, restricted her visitors, and criticized her publicly with a cruelty that eventually became impossible for even polite company to ignore. One winter afternoon, 3 familiar carriages arrived outside Dunmoran Hall, carrying women whose expensive gowns were now older, whose faces carried exhaustion instead of superiority, and whose pride had been stripped away by the very marriages they had once displayed as proof of their worth. They sat together inside the warm drawing room while snow fell silently beyond the tall windows. None of them could meet Leora's eyes easily. Shame sat heavily across shoulders that had once carried only confidence. Leora served them tea herself. She asked about their health. She offered rooms for as long as they needed, warmth for as long as winter lasted, and kindness without conditions or reminders of the years when none had been offered to her. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never revenge. It was becoming loved for the very heart they once dismissed as worthless. And the world eventually learned what the Ashgrove family discovered far too late. That true worth was never found in beauty, youth, or status, but in patience, loyalty, and a strength of spirit gentle enough to calm even the wildest heart.